All right, so going to continue our discussion of the 20s. When we left off, we were in the jazz age. And I mentioned to you that the jazz was this new type of free-form music that was targeting the youth. It was targeting particularly the young female population, okay? Well, if you take that same movement, that young idealistic movement that was in the music, and you apply it to literature, you get the lost generation. The lost generation was characterized by two authors mostly, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. The authors of this period tended to be expatriates that were disenfranchised or disenchanted with America post-World War I. They didn't like internationalism. They saw World War I as a colossal waste of time. And they thought that getting involved in foreign affairs would lead to more war. So you got guys like Fitzgerald, that's him there on the left. He, by the way, these two guys hated each other. They were the preeminent authors of their time, but you couldn't have two people more different. Fitzgerald was, he was a wealthy man about town. He and his wife Zelda were the it couple of the time. They'd have been the ones you see on the red carpet all the time. I get the feeling that F. Scott Fitzgerald would be on a reality show if he was alive today. His books were all about being disenchanted with wealth. They were almost always about the wealthy and how the wealthy lived, but how that even in all this prosperity and all this abundance, they were unable to find happiness. Books like This Side of Paradise and, of course, The Great Gatsby. I hope you have either read or seen The Great Gatsby. It's a classic that everybody needs to really read. To me, it's the classic novel of the jazz age. It describes what the jazz age was like. Kind of a caricature of it and cartoony, but I think it helps you understand it. Ernest Hemingway, that's him there on the right. He was a man's man. He didn't write books about fluffy things like parties and drinking and all that stuff. He wrote books about man testing himself against nature, like The Old Man of the Sea, where he's trying to catch this giant fish, or The Sun Also Rises, or he writes books about warfare, about hunting, again, about man testing himself. And he writes novels for men. That's something different than we'd seen in the 20s. Again, they despised each other. Ernest Hemingway once threatened to kill F. Scott Fitzgerald, in fact. He was a man's man like few had ever seen. He lived in Cuba at the end of his life because he was disenchanted with the United States. He had been an ambulance driver during World War I, where he acted very heroically. Later in life, he gets very, very sick. I think it was cancer. He gets very, very sick and ends up, rather than wilting away, because he was this large man, rather than wilting away and becoming weak, he committed suicide rather than experience that, because that was the way he saw the world. He thought that it was about man overcoming adversity. So we've seen the jazz age is what we call it in music, the lost generation in literature, and in the African American community we call it the Harlem Renaissance. There are always questions about the Harlem Renaissance on your STAR test. So when you're studying this stuff, pay special attention to the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem is a community of a borough of New York that exploded because of the migration from people from the South, from African Americans from the South. And you see how much it exploded. In 1914, there's about 50,000 people living in Harlem. It explodes to 200,000 by 1930. That's a big change. That's what, a 400% raise, I think. And the Harlem Renaissance was African American art and African American literature that was focused on their unique understanding of the world. A lot of mural art, a lot of beat poetry. Guys like this guy, Langston Hughes, one of the most famous poets of American history, and some would argue the greatest American poet. Emily Dickinson might get mad about you saying that, but he's definitely up there, probably the greatest of the 20th century anyway. Langston Hughes wrote poetry about what it was like to be a black man in America at the turn of the century. James Weldon was the first president of the NAACP. He was an author who also wrote about the black experience. These were Harlem Renaissance people. I'm going to give you an example of some of this so you can kind of see what it feels like. The poetry was not the kind of poetry that white Americans were comfortable with a lot of times, because it didn't have the rhyming scheme that we're used to. It wasn't, A, B, A, B, A, B like Shakespeare is. It was very much a free-form poem. This is from 1926, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. And I'm going to go ahead and read it to you so you can kind of hear how it's supposed to sound. And it doesn't really sound like poetry unless you're kind of familiar with it. The younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. The tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. So if you hear that, it's a weird rhyme scheme. It's something a little different. It's called free-form poetry. It kind of sounds almost like you would hear a message at church. Okay? Lots of inflection in it. But this is kind of characteristic of the Harlem Renaissance style of poetry. And I'll be honest, you either really like Langston Hughes or you really can't stand him. He's hard to get along with if you're not a poetry person. I kind of like Langston Hughes. A lot of people don't. We were going through a radio revolution at this time period. Think about how fast this happened. The modern radio, as we understand it, was invented by a guy named Marconi in the 1890s. And it was invented as more of a CB than a radio for listening. It was used for war to communicate. Okay? That was in 1890. By 1920, radios are so abundant that Warren Harding's landslide victory is taught all around the country. It's kind of a big deal. One of the most famous, in fact, the biggest radio show of the 1920s was a show called Amos and Andy. Amos and Andy was an incredibly racist show. It was about two black men trying to make it in society. It was funny, but it was very much making fun of these African Americans that moved up north during the African American migration, the Great Migration. Big show. Big enough that in the 1940s and 50s, a TV show spinoff came out called Amos and Andy. I like this slide because it shows you when the TV show came out, this is the people that played Amos and Andy, that's the two at the bottom there. But in reality, Amos and Andy were played by these two guys. Amos and Andy was actually played by two white guys from Brooklyn. They were two Jewish guys from Brooklyn, in fact, that were playing the part of Amos and Andy. Well, that goes to show you just how racist society was. A show about black people, and they didn't even get black people to play the parts. Not at all uncommon. This is kind of the golden age of flight. Now, I know we're backing up to 1903 a little bit here, but I do this so you can see how fast it happened. December 17th, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made the first recorded flight. Now, notice I didn't say the first flight. There are other people that claim to have flown before them, but we can't prove it. There's no recording of it. This one, there were people there to see it. There was eyewitnesses. There's even film footage of the second flight. These are two bicycle mechanics from Ohio, from Dayton, Ohio, and they end up deciding they can build something that flies. That's a picture of the first plane there. And the very first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the sand dunes down there. The flight lasts 12 seconds. The plane goes 120 feet, and it never gets higher than about 8 feet off the ground. We would hardly call that flight today. I mean, that's less air than Evel Knievel gets when he jumps cars. Okay, this is nothing. But it was the first manned flight. That was in 1903. By 1920, we have got planes so effective that we are sending transcontinental air mail. We're putting mail in planes and delivering it from one continent to another. That shows you how effective this was, how fast it was. That's only 17 years. We went from a 120-foot flight to flying between continents in 17 years. I used to have a guy that would come talk to my classes. He's passed away a few years ago. He was from right in this area. And he was the second person to break the sound barrier. He was Chuck Yeager's backup pilot. You don't know who Chuck Yeager is. He was an American Air Force pilot that was the first person to fly faster than the speed of sound. He was Chuck Yeager's backup pilot. If Yeager had gotten sick, he'd have been the guy that broke the sound barrier. And he used to tell me a story. He would tell my classes that when he learned to fly in the 1920s on biplanes. And he said the first time he ever flew, he got in a plane. He was taking off in his neighbor's yard. He was flying by himself. And as he's going down the pasture to take off, he said, I looked to my left, and there was a farmer on a tractor, and the tractor was going faster than he was. Okay? First time he ever flew, the tractor was going faster than his plane was. The last time he flew, he broke the sound barrier. That shows you how fast things change. That's one man's life, okay? The most famous of these pilots is Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh. He's an interesting character. Charles Lindbergh was what we call a barnstormer. He did aerobatics in the sky, airplane aerobatics. And they called it barnstorming because one of the tricks they would do is they would open up the doors of a barn, both sides, and the plane would come through and it would fly through the barn and come out the other side to the cheers of people. It was incredibly dangerous. Lindbergh had crashed several planes. So much so that he was about to lose his license to participate in these things. And he needs to protect himself. That's why he makes a living. So what does he do? He comes up with a stunt. Charles Lindbergh in 1927 gets on his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, and he announces that he's going to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. And he does it. He's the first person to fly solo non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. Excuse me. It took him 33 and a half hours to do it, and he was America's greatest hero after this. Nobody was going to take his pilot's license away after that. Okay? Charles Lindbergh. Honestly, after he did that, he probably could have ran for president and won. He was the most popular man in the country for a brief little bit. 1928 comes along. We elect Herbert Hoover. He's the Republican candidate. The Democrats nominated Al Smith of New York. Al Smith had a lot of stuff going against him, unfortunately. The biggest one was he was Roman Catholic. He was the first Roman Catholic to run for president. And today, that's not that big of a deal. Although we know, you're of a certain age, you remember President Kennedy was Roman Catholic, and he had a hard time because of it. John Kerry, when he ran for president, was a Roman Catholic, and he had a tough time because of that. But Herbert Hoover wins 444 to 87. This is a landslide victory. Hoover was expected to be a great president. He was, on paper, the right man for the job. He was a trained economist. He had successfully ran businesses. During World War I, he had ran the War Industries Board. He had gone to South America and ran relief agencies. The man knows how to run businesses, and he's going to be the guy in charge. So he gets elected in 1928, at the height of the Roaring Twenties, when everybody was doing well. But nobody saw the signs that the economy was getting ready to collapse. The big boom of the Roaring Twenties is about to end, and when it ends so dramatically. We call it the Great Stock Market Crash. I want to talk a little bit about how it happened. The stock market, if you don't understand what the stock market is, you're buying shares in companies, and it's honestly, it's very closely akin to gambling. You're buying shares in a company, and you're gambling that that company is going to make more profit, and they'll be able to pay you a dividend, or you'll be able to sell your share at a higher rate. Now, in American history, the stock market had never lost value, ever. It was a safe bet. As a result, in the 1920s, all this money people had, they started investing in the stock market. The problem is, people started investing in the stock market first without researching. So they would just put their money in anywhere. They try and bargain shop. So they were investing in bad companies. And second thing they were doing is they were speculating. That means they were borrowing the money to invest. So how that works. I look at the stock market and I go, this is a great deal. I want to buy $1,000 worth of Walmart stock. But I don't have $1,000. What I do is I go to the bank and I borrow the $1,000. They're going to charge me, I don't know, let's say 10% interest. That's a lot. They're going to charge me 10% interest. What I am gambling is I can borrow that $1,000. I can go buy the stock, and before I have to pay that money back to the bank, the stock will go up in value enough that I can sell that, I can make my interest, put the profit in my pocket, and pay you back your money. That is an awesome way to make money, as long as the stock market is going up. But once the market goes down a little bit, now you have to sell that stock at a loss, and you still have to pay back their money, and you don't have it. So if you look at this, people are speculating, they're borrowing lots of money. And in September of 1929, the stock market hit its all-time high. And then it starts to go down. Now at first people go, well, okay, it's leveling off. It's not growing, but that's okay. People are a little nervous. And for about a month, the stock market is stagnant. There's no growth. There's not really any big losses, but it's fairly stable. And then on October 24th, the sell-off begins. People need to pay the money back to the bank that they had borrowed. So they start selling off the stock to get the money to pay the bank back. Well, the sell-off drives the prices of stock down. Well, when the prices drop on the stock, people panic, and they start selling more stock before it drops more. That's going to hit this domino effect where by October 29th, that's Black Tuesday, the stock market lost over half of its value in one day. In one day. This is how bad was this? Black Tuesday, October 29th. There were people that woke up that morning as millionaires and went to bed that night broke. It was so bad, people were jumping out of windows and killing themselves because they lost whole fortunes on the market. The stock market continues to drop all the way through to 1932. By 1932, the stock market is 89% down from its height. It has lost 89% of its value. That money's just gone. It's money that doesn't exist anymore. It's perceived value that is gone. The stock market is not going to recover until 1951, 22 years later. Okay? This is going to signal the beginning of the Great Depression. It'll be the end of our roaring 20s. And the next section we're going to talk about the Great Depression and the rise of FDR. Okay? All right. I'm going to stop there. You have got plenty of time. Please take advantage of your time and work on your study guides. You have a test in 1 week. Okay? 1 week. We have lectures next week. My plan is to have a lecture Monday and Wednesday, and probably the next Monday, and then we'll have our test. So a week from Wednesday. Okay? That'll be the last big test that we have as far as these kind of tests go, because your last test will be just like it was last year, be a take-home. Okay? So you want to do well on this one. If you got any questions, I'll hang around for a little while. If you don't, you can always reach me through email or text messaging, and I am glad to answer any questions. Okay? Y'all have a good day. I'll see you later.
Do we have any other quizzes that we're going to have to do?
I am not sure.